Usually when we look at a map of the world, there is this ingrained expectation of precision, like engineering.
Right.
You
Yeah.
look at a country and you see the solid black line of its border, and it's just comforting, you know?
Right.
You point to a shape and say, well, there it is. That's exactly who lives there, and that's precisely what they are.
It's very binary.
Yeah, it's clean. It makes sense to us.
It is a very modern comfort, though. I mean, we are incredibly attached to categorization.
Oh,
We
absolutely.
desperately want global history to be this neat series of, like, color-coded blocks that we can just easily digest and file away.
But then you step into the historical, the geographical, and really the cultural landscape of North Africa and the Middle East, and suddenly that neat color-coded map just completely dissolves.
It really does.
You try to draw a hard line and it bleeds. We are looking at a human landscape today that defies every single rigid boundary we try to, project onto it.
Which makes it so fascinating.
So today's deep dive is an expansive journey into a really dense, absolutely fascinating set of sources. We're covering the history and cultural evolution of North Africa and the Middle East. And our mission today is very specific.
Right.
We are here to dismantle a popular, incredibly reductive myth.
A myth that, honestly, continues to heavily distort how this part of the world is understood globally.
Yeah.
It is the myth that North Africa and the Middle East represent this single monolithic civilization, a civilization that outside observers often wrongly define, well, purely by modern conflict, or by some weird notion of ancient stagnation.
Which is just so inaccurate based on the sources.
Exactly. We are going to explore this region through a far more accurate, much more dynamic lens. We are going to look at it as humanity's ultimate crossroads civilization.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to really grasp how a region functions as a crossroads, we can't just start with the people.
No, you can't.
We have to start with the physical ground we're standing on. We need to look at geography not just as a passive stage where history happens, but as the primary author of the story.
Geography is destiny, absolutely. But in this region, it is a profoundly polarizing kind of destiny.
How so?
Well, the foundational environment of North Africa and the Middle East is defined by this striking, almost violent contrast. On one hand, you have massive, punishing expanses of arid and semi-arid land.
Like the Sahara.
Right, the Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Syrian steppe. These are environments that are, frankly, hostile to dense human habitation. But human life didn't just scatter evenly across this space.
Because they couldn't, right? They had to find water.
Exactly. It concentrated intensely in very specific, highly restricted zones.
We are talking about the famous life-giving arteries, the Nile Valley in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates River Basin in Mesopotamia, and the Levantine coast running right along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean.
Yes. And then away from the water, you have these vital, rugged, high-altitude pockets, like the Atlas Mountains in North Africa or the Zagros Mountains in Iran.
Right.
And we also really have to factor in the oasis chains, those fragile little dots of green stretching across the Sahara and the Arabian deserts.
So what's the real takeaway here? Why does this specific geography matter so deeply?
What we have to understand, and the real why behind this region's development, is that this specific geography dictated human settlement in a really extreme way.
Okay.
Dense, enduring, highly bureaucratic states grew right on top of the rivers and the coasts. Meanwhile, highly mobile pastoralists, the nomads, they roamed the vast steppes and desert margins.
And they had to interact.
They did. And connecting these two vastly different ways of life were the oasis belts and caravan towns. They acted as the vital intermediaries.
So the geography here is a paradox. It acts as a massive lethal barrier, but simultaneously as an unavoidable bridge.
That's a great way to put it.
As I was reading through all these sources, this specific picture started forming in my head. Instead of looking at the map of this region as a giant solid block of continental land, it's actually much more accurate to view it as an archipelago.
Oh, like a chain of islands.
Yeah, exactly, like an island chain. The rivers, the mountain valleys, the oases, those are the islands of life. And they are separated by these vast, dangerous oceans of sand and arid rock.
That is a brilliant analogy. It really captures the reality on the ground.
And just like a literal ocean archipelago forces its people to build boats and become, master sailors, this environment forced the people here to become expert navigators of the desert.
Right, they had to be.
The Levantine Corridor, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, these weren't just bodies of water or empty strips of land. They were the trade winds connecting the islands.
And that navigation creates a very specific societal dynamic. The region repeatedly produced societies that were highly local in their ecology,
Meaning what, exactly?
meaning they were deeply tied to the specific rhythms of their particular river bend or their mountain valley. But simultaneously, they had a completely cosmopolitan worldview.
Because they had to trade.
Yes, they had to trade across those oceans of sand to survive. They really couldn't afford to be insular. I want you, the listener, to consider for a moment how an environment like that shapes human psychology over thousands of years.
It has to have a huge impact.
It does. Because water and arable land were incredibly scarce, survival wasn't something you could ever achieve alone. It depended on tight kin networks, rigorous seasonal coordination, and negotiated loyalty.
I am so glad you brought that up, because it explains something I always wondered about when looking at this region.
What's that?
Well, the sources emphasize that traits like hospitality, family honor, and strict communal obligation carry an unusual amount of social weight in this part of the world.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's easy for outsiders to look at that and think, oh, what quaint cultural traditions. But when you look at it through the lens of this geography, you realize these aren't just polite customs, they are ancient survival currencies.
Precisely. If you are navigating a literal ocean of sand, and your water skins are empty, and you finally come across an isolated settlement, their cultural obligation to show hospitality literally determines if you live or die.
Wow. Yeah, that puts it in perspective.
And the people in that settlement know that next season, their well might dry up, and they will be the ones walking across the desert begging for water.
So it's reciprocal survival.
Exactly. Scarcity was ritualized into culture. When isolation is dangerous, trust, mutual obligation, and reputation become the most valuable commodities you can possess.
That makes total sense.
This deeply embedded psychology of connection and mutual reliance is the absolute bedrock of everything that comes next.
Because when you have a landscape structured like an archipelago, a landscape that forces people to constantly move, connect, and cross vast spaces, it naturally channels migration.
It's a funnel.
Right, a geographical funnel. And that is exactly why this region didn't just host later civilizations. It served as the literal exit ramp for the human species. We have to go back into deep time here.
We really do. To truly understand the sheer weight of the layers in this region, we have to look back 50,000 to 60,000 years. Even further, actually.
Yeah, the timeline in the sources is staggering.
The Levantine corridor, which encompasses modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, was the principal escape route for Homo sapiens leaving Africa to populate the rest of the globe.
And the archaeological evidence backing this up is just wild. The sources highlight specific sites like Shkul and Kafsa.
Yes, those are crucial sites.
They're cave sites in modern Israel, and what archaeologists found there completely upends the old simplistic idea of human migration. They didn't just find a few scattered tools.
No, they found early human remains dating back roughly 100,000 years, and then another distinct wave around 50,000 years ago.
Which is mind-blowing.
What's fascinating here is that these findings prove it wasn't just a one-way turnstile. It wasn't a clean, singular mass exodus where humans marched out of Africa and just never looked back.
Right.
It was a dynamic, shifting frontier. Early human populations were pulsing into the Levant, interacting with the environment, sometimes retreating due to climatic shifts, sometimes interacting with Neanderthals, and then pushing outward again.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this right, though. If the region was this massive highway out of Africa, does that mean North Africa and the Middle East were just temporary waiting rooms?
That's a common assumption.
Like, did everyone just pass through, leaving the area empty until the agricultural revolution?
No, not at all. And that is a crucial distinction to make. The ancient DNA evidence cited in our sources completely shatters that assumption.
Okay, how so?
Well, North Africa, for instance, wasn't just a receiving edge or a transit lounge. It was a site of continuous, complex layering. Yes. You had indigenous populations, you had Levantine groups moving back westward into Africa, you had sub-Saharan populations moving north, and later you even had Mediterranean and Iberian migrants crossing over.
Because, as the sources point out, before the agricultural revolution, the climate was vastly different. There were long climatic phases where the Sahara wasn't a desert at all.
Right, it was green.
Yeah, the Green Sahara. It was a savanna with lakes and river systems.
Exactly. Most people in this deep time period lived as hunter-gatherers, fishers, and mobile foragers, navigating a completely different ecosystem than what we see today.
It's so hard to picture now.
It is. And then when the climate began to dry and the transition to farming finally began, centering heavily in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE, it was not a sudden clean switch.
See, I always pictured the agricultural revolution as this massive light bulb moment.
Most people do.
Like someone plants a seed, builds a fence, and suddenly everyone just drops their spears and starts building towns.
That's the textbook version for sure. But the reality was a messy, highly localized patchwork. Some groups adopted full-time farming. Other groups right next door retained mixed foraging and hunting economies for thousands of years.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they traded with the farmers, they fought with the farmers, they intermingled.
So what does this all mean for us today? It means there was no clean replacement of people.
Exactly.
Whenever a new group arrived or a new technology like farming was adopted, they didn't just wipe the slate clean and start a new society from scratch. The identity of the region from its very genesis is additive. It's not subtractive.
Additive, yeah.
It's like sediment settling at the bottom of a lake over millennia.
That principle of layering is the defining algorithm for the entire history of the Middle East and North Africa.
Right.
Early populations formed through continuous connection and stacking, rather than through isolation.
Right.
You didn't lose who you were when someone new arrived or when the climate changed. You simply added a new layer to the human sediment.
And as that sediment built up and the agricultural surplus allowed populations to boom, those little islands of life we talked about earlier started to get very crowded.
And very organized.
Exactly. We transition now from the deep time of hunter-gatherers to the birth of humanity's earliest large-scale civilizations.
This is where the sheer density of history in this region becomes almost dizzying to comprehend.
Yeah, it's a lot.
You have the rise of incredibly complex urban societies in Mesopotamia, first Sumer, followed by the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian states.
And these weren't just large villages.
No, these were massive engineered landscapes built around complex irrigation projects, massive temple economies, and highly structured kingship.
And then slightly to the west, you have the rise of Egypt,
Yeah.
which is a completely different flavor of civilization, right?
Yeah.
Driven by the seasonal, highly predictable flooding of the Nile.
That predictability is key.
Because it supported a deeply centralized rule and the kind of monumental architecture, the pyramids, the massive temples, that still dominates our imagination today.
And we can't ignore the coasts either. Along the Mediterranean, you had the maritime mercantile societies.
Like Phoenicians.
Yes, the Phoenicians in the Levant, who built their wealth on sea trade and purple dye, and who eventually expanded across the water to seed Carthage in North Africa, creating a massive Western Mediterranean power.
It is just a flurry of innovation, but they weren't all operating from the same blueprint, were they? It wasn't just civilization version 1.0 applied everywhere.
Not at all. And contrasting how they operated is really key to understanding the region's diversity.
Okay, let's contrast them.
Mesopotamia was often a chaotic, hyper-competitive network of rival city-states. It was prone to constant imperial turnover because it was geographically open to invasion from the mountains and the steppes.
Ah, right. Hard to defend.
Exactly. Egypt, on the other hand, protected by deserts on both sides and anchored by a single river, tended towards strong, enduring territorial centralization. The Levantine societies were politically fragmented, but commercially brilliant.
But the breakthrough they all shared was a massive leap in human organization.
Yes.
The sources make a really interesting point that civilization here wasn't just about hauling stones to build ziggurats. It was about organizing people and, crucially, organizing memory.
The administrative technology, we are talking about the invention of writing systems, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt,
Right.
the development of complex legal codes like the Code of Hammurabi, the creation of vast administrative records. They figured out how to project authority and maintain societal memory across time and space.
And here's a detail from the deep dive sources that literally made me pause and reevaluate how I view the modern world.
What was that?
Historically in this region, cities mattered more than borders. People identified deeply, profoundly with their city long before the concept of modern national borders ever existed.
It's so true.
I mean, we're talking about cities like Aleppo, Damascus, Cairo, Fez, Baghdad.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it fundamentally challenges our modern political conditioning. Well, modern nationalism asks you to pledge allegiance to a massive, often abstract territory defined by arbitrary lines drawn on a map.
Right, which you've probably never even seen most of.
Exactly. But for thousands of years in the Middle East and North Africa, your entire universe was your city and its immediate agricultural hinterland.
Because your city was your entire economy. It dictated your specific dialect. It housed your religious microculture. It was your literal physical safety behind its walls.
Exactly. Look at a city like Damascus or Aleppo. They have been continuously inhabited for millennia. Empires washed over them, foreign kings marched in, demanded tribute, and eventually collapsed. But the city endured.
The city outlasts the empire.
Yes. The civic institutions, the merchant guilds, the local religious scholars, they just kept functioning. The urban identity in this region has thousands of years of momentum behind it.
I want you, the listener, to think about your own hometown or city for a second. Does it feel more central to who you are, to your actual daily reality, than your country's massive political borders?
It's a great question.
In the Middle East and North Africa, that localized feeling is baked right into the bedrock. And it makes perfect sense because the borders and the overarching rulers were constantly changing, which naturally pushes us into the era of the great overlays.
Yes, the overlays.
Yeah.
Because those wealthy, hyper-organized cities we just discussed were incredibly tempting prizes.
Oh, for sure.
As we transition into the classical and Islamic eras, the history of the region is characterized by a relentless wave of empires attempting to conquer, tax, and unify this vast crossroads.
It's just wave after wave.
We see the Persians sweep through, then the Hellenistic Greeks following the conquests of Alexander the Great, then the Romans who viewed North Africa and Egypt as the breadbasket of their empire.
Right, the Roman grain supply.
And the Byzantines, and eventually the Arab Caliphates and the Ottoman Empire.
And with these massive imperial sweeps came the spread of major language families. The sources emphasize the dominance of the Afro-Asiatic language family.
Which is huge.
It's this massive linguistic tree that includes Arabic, Hebrew, Amharic, and ancient Egyptian. And alongside that, you have the vital, enduring presence of the Amaza or Berber societies stretching across the mountains and deserts of North Africa.
The linguistic landscape is just as layered as the genetic one.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the text tackles what I think is easily the biggest, most pervasive modern misconception about this region.
Yes.
And that is the concept of Arabization.
This is a vital knot to untangle, because when people hear the term Arabization, specifically following the rapid expansion of Islam out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, the assumption is often a total ethnic replacement.
Right. The popular imagination pictures an army of Arabs riding out of the desert, conquering the Middle East and North Africa, and physically replacing the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Mesopotamians, and the North Africans.
And the sources are incredibly clear on this. That is completely false.
But wait, I have to push back here for the sake of the listener. If it wasn't an ethnic replacement, why does almost everyone in those regions today identify as Arab?
That's the core question.
How did the overlay become so absolute if the original people didn't leave?
Because becoming Arab in this specific historical context was a cultural and linguistic assimilation, not a genetic erasure. It was the ultimate overlay.
Okay, walk me through that.
What happened was that Arabic became the language of the new imperial administration. It was the language of upward mobility, the language of the vast new trade network stretching from Spain to India, and critically, the language of the new dominant religion, Islam.
So if you are an ambitious local merchant in, say, 8th century Damascus or a landowner in Egypt, learning Arabic isn't just a hobby.
No, not at all.
It's a requirement to survive and thrive in the new system.
Precisely. Local populations who were descendants of ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, Arameans, and Masai, they gradually adopted the Arabic language.
And the identity followed.
Over centuries, yes. They adopted Arab political identities and tribal affiliations to navigate the new social hierarchy, but they retained their deep pre-Arab ancestry.
Right.
An Egyptian Copt, who eventually converted to Islam and adopted Arabic, didn't lose their Egyptian roots, they added a new layer.
I love that. It's like applying a universal operating system to a bunch of highly specialized, incredibly diverse computers.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. The internal hardware of an Egyptian, a Syrian, or a Moroccan is still beautifully distinct, shaped by thousands of years of local history. But now they're all running the same Arabic operating system. They can all suddenly talk to each other, trade with each other, and share literature. It was synthesis, not subtraction.
And that concept of managing diverse hardware really reaches its zenith centuries later into the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottomans are a fascinating case study here.
They really are. The Ottomans, who ruled vast stretches of this region from the 14th to the early 20th century, understood something fundamental. They knew that trying to force a monolithic identity, trying to make everyone Turkish or homogeneously Islamic, would be an administrative nightmare.
It would just lead to constant rebellion.
Exactly.
So how did they handle it? Because ruling over Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, Jews, and diverse Islamic sects across 3 continents sounds basically impossible without constant war.
They managed it structurally through something called the millet system.
Millet, what does that mean?
Millet loosely translates to a religious community or nation. The genius of the Ottoman system was that your primary legal and social identity wasn't tied to the physical territory you lived in. It was tied to your religion.
Okay, break that down for me. How did that actually work on a day-to-day basis?
Let's say you were a Greek Orthodox Christian living in 16th century Istanbul or Damascus. Your primary legal authority for everyday life wasn't the local Muslim judge. It was your own Christian patriarch. Yes, the Ottoman Sultan granted the patriarch the authority to collect taxes from the Christian community, to run their own schools, and to operate their own courts for marriage, inheritance, and internal disputes.
That is wild. So you could have 3 people living on the exact same street, a Sunni Muslim, a Sephardic Jew, and an Armenian Christian, and they are essentially existing in 3 distinct parallel legal universes.
Exactly. They interacted constantly in the marketplace, of course. But when it came to law and communal identity, they were governed by their own religious hierarchies.
So when did they interact with the empire itself?
Those hierarchies only converged at the very top when they answered to the Ottoman state. The empire survived for centuries precisely because it coordinated difference rather than violently erasing it. It institutionalized the layers.
Which perfectly transitions us away from the grand courts of the sultans and caliphs and down into the actual streets, the kitchens, and the caravans.
Fun stuff.
Yeah, because this region didn't make its immense wealth just by conquering territory. It made its wealth by moving things, by being the ultimate filter.
We are talking about the heart of the global economy for centuries. The Silk Roads terminating in Levantine ports, the vast Saharan caravan routes moving gold and salt, the Mediterranean maritime networks.
That's the hub of everything.
The Middle East and North Africa sat squarely at the geographical center of the Old World. They taxed goods, they protected merchants, but most importantly, they translated ideas.
Right. The region wasn't just a passive highway where a cart rolls in from China and rolls out to Europe without anyone touching it.
No, not at all. And the analogy you mentioned earlier is perfect here.
Yeah. As I read through the section on trade, I kept thinking, it's not a bridge, it's a prism.
A prism.
Right. Light comes in from one side, whether that's a philosophy, a spice, or a musical instrument. It bends, it interacts with the dense cultural material inside the region, and it comes out the other side as a completely different, highly complex spectrum of colors.
Let's look at a concrete example of that prism effect. Philosophy. During the Islamic Golden Age, Greek philosophical texts from thinkers like Aristotle and Plato entered the region. But they weren't just hoarded in a library.
What happened to them?
They were translated into Arabic, deeply analyzed, intensely critiqued, and drastically expanded upon by Islamic scholars like Avicenna and Averroes, as well as Jewish scholars like Maimonides.
So they synthesized it with their own theological and scientific frameworks.
Exactly. And then, centuries later, those dramatically enriched, heavily annotated texts re-entered Europe, primarily through Spain and Sicily, and they fundamentally sparked the European Renaissance.
Wow.
The region filtered and transformed human knowledge.
And you don't just have to look at dusty philosophical texts to see this. You can literally taste this synthesis.
Food history is the best history.
It really is. The notes bring up food, which, let's be honest, is the best way to understand any culture. Let's look at a staple of North Africa, couscous.
A perfect example of culinary layering.
Right. Couscous is deeply, fundamentally rooted as an indigenous Amazigh or Berber staple. It's been eaten in the Maghreb for millennia.
Long before any Arab empire.
Exactly. But over the centuries, as the crossroads functioned, that bowl of couscous absorbed Arab spices rolling in from the east. It absorbed Ottoman culinary techniques.
And Moorish influences.
Yeah, Moorish influences brought back by refugees fleeing the Spanish Reconquista. And later, it even absorbed French colonial impacts, like the incorporation of certain vegetables or serving styles.
So a single everyday bowl of couscous is a layered historical document.
It's amazing. And we see the exact same phenomenon of the prism in the region's soundscape.
Music is such a clear indicator of this.
Consider the deep musical heritage of the Middle East and North Africa. The sources specifically highlight the oud.
The oud.
It's a stringed instrument, right? Sort of looks like a lute.
Exactly. It's a fretless stringed instrument.
Yeah.
And it is, in fact, the direct ancestor to the European lute and eventually the modern guitar.
Wait, really? The guitar comes from the oud.
Yes. But it's not just the instrument itself, it's how the music is organized. The region developed the makam system.
Now, I've heard that term, but I've always struggled to really understand it. Is it just like an Arabic musical scale?
It's much more profound than a simple scale. In Western music, you have major and minor scales, which are fixed intervals. The makam is a highly complex system of melodic modes that organizes not just the notes, but the microtones,
Gamay crouton.
the notes between the notes. More importantly, each makam dictates the specific emotional feeling, the mood, and the acceptable ornamentation of the music.
So it's very structured but deeply emotional.
Yes, and this system wasn't invented in a vacuum. It absorbed Persian court music, Arabic poetic rhythms, Turkish military sounds, and North African beats. It is an aesthetic ecosystem that organizes beauty through synthesis.
But despite all of this undeniable dynamism, the philosophy, the food, the music, this crossroads has been severely flattened in the global imagination.
Largely, yes.
The tropes of fantasy world building that you and I consume today in movies and books, the sprawling, chaotic bazaars, the massive golden domes, the secretive, complex court politics, the flying carpets,
They are everywhere.
they are almost entirely rooted in a simplified, cartoonish vision of this region's history.
And there is a very specific, dangerous trap here, which the sources address directly. They bring up the concept of Orientalism, a term famously coined and critiqued by the scholar Edward Said.
Right, so for the listener, how does Said define Orientalism?
Orientalism is essentially the historical and cultural framework through which Western societies have studied, imagined, and ultimately dominated the East.
Correct.
It reduces this incredibly complex, intellectually vibrant engine of global connection into a passive caricature.
It portrays the region as intensely sensual but fundamentally backwards.
Yeah.
Deeply spiritual, maybe, but inherently irrational.
Yes,
Like-
exactly.
Like it's ancient but totally static and incapable of modern progress.
Precisely. It strips the region of its historical agency. Instead of recognizing it as a place of active intellectual synthesis, Orientalism turns the Middle East and North Africa into an exotic, mysterious backdrop for Western narratives and Western interventions.
It's the difference between seeing medieval Baghdad for what it actually was, a bustling cosmopolitan hub of advanced mathematics, groundbreaking medicine, and global trade,
Right.
and seeing a Hollywood movie set of a dusty desert town where everyone is just waiting around for a white savior to show up and advance the plot.
That's a very accurate way to describe the problem. It completely flattens the prism.
And I want to pivot here because if there is one aspect of this region that gets flattened and misunderstood more than any other by outside observers, it has to be religion.
Without a doubt. North Africa and the Middle East are the birthplace and the historical heartland of three of the world's major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Right.
The profound modern misconception, especially in the West, is to view religion there through a strictly post-Enlightenment lens.
Yeah. We tend to view religion as a purely private individual belief system, something you just do internally.
Like a personal choice.
Exactly. You go to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque on the weekend, you feel spiritual for an hour or two, and then on Monday morning, you go back to your real secular life.
But this raises an important question, one the sources insist we confront. What if religion isn't just an ideological layer painted on top of society?
Okay, what if it isn't?
What if religion is the actual infrastructure of the society?
That is a massive paradigm shift. Explain what that looks like historically.
Let's put ourselves back in 12th century Cairo or Damascus. If you are a merchant and you have a contract dispute over a shipment of grain, you don't go to a secular downtown courthouse.
Where do you?
You go to the local religious scholar, the Qadi, who uses Islamic jurisprudence to settle the trade dispute. If you want to educate your child, you send them to a madrasa, which is physically and financially attached to the mosque.
Right.
If you're destitute, sick, or traveling, you rely on the waqf.
The Waqf. What is that?
Yes, the religious charitable endowments. Wealthy individuals would leave property to a waqf, and the revenue from that property would fund hospitals, soup kitchens, public baths, and orphanages.
Oh, wow. So the mosque wasn't just a place for prayer.
Exactly. The mosque complex was City Hall, the Supreme Court, the Department of Education, and the local hospital all rolled into one.
That makes so much sense.
Historically, religious institutions provided the legal framework, the social welfare net, the basis for political legitimacy for the rulers, and the absolute core of communal identity.
So when modern observers watch the news, look at the Middle East, and ask, well, why is religion so central to the conflicts over there? Why can't they just separate church and state?
It's a fundamental misunderstanding.
It is. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the historical landscape. It's like looking at a Western country and asking, why is the Constitution, the court system, and the IRS so central to your political conflicts?
It's a perfect parallel.
To extract religion from that society would be like extracting the steel girders from a skyscraper and expecting it to still stand.
And we must strongly emphasize, as the sources do, that this religious infrastructure has never been a single monolithic block of fanatical orthodoxy.
No, of course not.
Throughout the region's history, you have had rigid, highly legalistic strands of faith existing right alongside, and often blending with deeply mystical and esoteric traditions.
Like Sufism in Islam or Kabbalah in Judaism.
Yes. You've had massive movements of popular folk religion based around local shrines and saints. You've had philosophical reform movements trying to reconcile faith with Greek logic.
It's incredibly diverse.
And you've had long, rich traditions of skepticism and secular poetry, all coexisting within the exact same cities. It was never just one singular way to believe. The spiritual landscape was as noisy, crowded, and layered as the bazaars.
Which is just incredible to picture, this vibrant, intensely layered historical reality operating over millennia. Right, but then as we move into the 19th and 20th centuries, the timeline accelerates dramatically. We have to leave the era of slow-moving caravans and ancient city-states and crash headfirst into what the sources astutely call modern compression.
The transition to the modern era in this region was not a smooth evolution. It was a series of profound, overlapping, often traumatic shocks.
What's the first shock?
First, you have the slow, agonizing decline and eventual collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which, as we discussed with the MOAT system, had provided the overarching structural architecture for centuries.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
It certainly does.
As the Ottomans receded, European colonialism flooded in. You have the French in Algeria and the Levant, the Italians in Libya, the British in Egypt and Iraq.
They intervene heavily.
They extract vast resources, and they fundamentally, violently restructure the local institutions.
And critically, they literally redrew the maps. We cannot discuss this region without addressing the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Right. This is the infamous secret treaty during World War I.
Yes. British and French diplomats took a map of the Arab provinces of the crumbling Ottoman Empire and essentially drew straight lines across it, dividing it into spheres of influence.
They created new nation-states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, whose borders often had absolutely nothing to do with the older, deeply rooted social realities.
They ignored those ancient urban identities we talked about. They ignored tribal lands, nomadic migration routes, and sectarian realities.
They just slapped a geometric grid over a layered palimpsest.
And almost immediately on top of that massive colonial boundary drawing trauma comes another transformational shock: the discovery of immense oil wealth.
Hydrocarbons changed everything.
They completely shifted the global geopolitical gravity toward the region. It elevated historically marginalized parts of the Arabian Gulf to unimaginable, dizzying wealth.
And brought a lot of attention.
It intensified foreign political and military intervention to secure that oil. And it triggered massive, unprecedented labor migrations within the region itself, pulling millions of workers from Egypt, the Levant, and South Asia into the Gulf.
The resulting demographic and political landscape today is just incredibly complex.
It's a web.
You have Arab majorities across many states, yes, but you have massive, vital, non-Arab or partly non-Arab populations living within those borders.
Like the Amazigh.
Right, the Amazigh in North Africa, who maintain a deeply rooted, distinct linguistic and cultural identity despite centuries of Arabization. You have the Kurds spread across the mountainous borders of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran.
Forming one of the world's largest stateless populations.
You have Persians in Iran, Turks in Turkey, and numerous absolutely crucial minority communities whose histories stretch back to antiquity.
The Copts in Egypt, the Druze in the Levant, the Assyrians and Chaldeans in Mesopotamia.
And the key tensions we see dominating the headlines today arise directly from trying to govern this ancient, pluralistic, layered reality using rigid modern tools like the nation-state.
It's a clash of systems.
You have the tension of tradition versus progress, where rapid global technology clashes with powerful inherited moral worlds. You have unity versus fragmentation, where central governments try to enforce singular national identities on populations whose history is visibly, stubbornly diverse.
And you have the ongoing, often violent tension of religion versus secular governance. as societies struggle to decide what role that ancient infrastructure of faith should play in a modern bureaucratic state.
I was trying to conceptualize this, and the analogy that really clicks for me, and I think the deep dive sources heavily support this, is that it's like the entire history of the region was put into a massive zip file.
Oh, a zip file. I like that.
The past didn't get replaced or overwritten by modernity. The tribal loyalties, the sectarian divides, the colonial traumas, the ancient urban pride, and the modern nationalistic ambitions.
Wait, they didn't happen sequentially and fade away.
No, they didn't.
They are all running simultaneously right now on the exact same hard drive. The past just got violently compressed into the present. Compression is the perfect word. And that compression creates intense internal pressure. But that pressure is very often misread and misunderstood from the outside.
Which leads to what the notes refer to as the external perception loop.
Exactly.
So explain the loop for us.
Because the Middle East and North Africa sit on top of the world's energy supply and straddle vital global trade routes, the region is constantly being watched, studied, defined, and reported on by outsiders.
Constantly.
But because international news is driven by conflict, the external narrative broadcast to the rest of the world is almost always relentlessly focused on war, instability, extremism, or those flattened Orientalist tropes we discussed.
But here is the tragic, insidious part of the loop. Over time, in a hyper-connected world, those simplified, negative external narratives can sometimes feed back into the region itself.
They absolutely do.
When the whole world constantly tells you that you are defined by ancient sectarian hatred or inherent instability, some factions begin to internalize those distortions.
It becomes a sociological echo chamber. External misunderstanding leads to aggressive foreign policy reactions, which disrupts the region, which in turn leads to actions that reinforce the original negative stereotype.
It's a vicious cycle.
Breaking that loop requires profound historical empathy. It requires a willingness to look past the headlines and see the layered reality, which is exactly why the final section of our source material is so vital.
Yes, it introduces a deeply human philosophical perspective to bring all this massive historical weight, all these empires and timelines, down to a purely human level.
We need that grounding.
The sources introduce a specific reflective authorial lens, referred to simply as Tira's lens.
Tira's perspective is poetic, but it is devastatingly accurate. Through her lens, we start looking at this region as a geopolitical chessboard of oil reserves and military bases.
What does she see it as?
She sees it as a geography of thresholds, a geography of deep memory and often a profound exile.
She frames identity in this region as both a beautiful, rich inheritance and an incredibly heavy burden. It's a place where old historical wounds, the sack of a city, a colonial betrayal, a sectarian split, they never fully vanish.
But the crucial part of Tira's lens is that these wounds are not just sources of endless despair.
Right.
They're continually transmuted into human meaning. They're turned into devastatingly beautiful poetry, into intricate musical maquems, into profound theological reflection, and into enduring communal ritual.
Tira explicitly rejects the lazy, popular clash of civilizations narrative that pits East versus West in a permanent war.
She views the history of North Africa and the Middle East not as a battlefield, but as a long, continuous human diary. A diary that has been written in sand, carved in stone, written in blood, whispered in prayer, and exchanged in trade.
I want you to truly reflect on what that implies. Tira's ultimate takeaway is that places of intense conflict and historical trauma are, almost by necessity, places of intense, brilliant creativity.
It's a powerful thought.
The exact same geographical crossroads that brought invading armies and imperial destruction also brought the profound cross-pollination of ideas.
This region gave rise to the scriptures of billions of people. It laid the mathematical foundations of modern science. It built the first truly global trade networks and developed incredibly durable, tested arts of coexistence.
The region is living, breathing proof that human beings can be deeply wounded by history and yet still use the weight of that history to build profound meaning.
It proves that we can keep making worlds together, even when history gives us every excuse to split apart.
So let's step back and look at the massive journey we've taken today. We started in that arid, violent geography, the archipelago of islands that forced early humans to connect, to invent hospitality just to survive.
We walk through the deep time of human migration, watching as Homo sapiens pulsed out of Africa, not replacing each other, but layering their identities like sediment.
We witnessed the rise of mighty ancient cities that commanded deep loyalties millennia before anyone ever drew a national border.
We examined the great imperial overlays, learning that processes like Arabization, were about adopting a shared cultural and linguistic operating system, rather than erasing the indigenous hardware.
We saw the region act as a brilliant prism, filtering Greek philosophy, Indian spices, and local ingredients to transform global culture.
We reframed our understanding of faith, realizing that religion here wasn't a private Sunday hobby, but the absolute load-bearing infrastructure of ancient societies.
And finally, we looked at the modern era as a massive, high-pressure compression of all these diverse layers, struggling against the artificial borders drawn by colonial powers.
Ultimately, North Africa and the Middle East taught the world how powerful a crossroads can be.
It is a place where human identity is never a singular, pure, isolated thing. It is a layered, continuous sediment. It is a human manuscript that has been written on, partially erased, and written over again century after century.
The ultimate historical palimpsest.
Exactly. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to take with you today.
Give it to us.
If the Middle East and North Africa show us so clearly, and sometimes so painfully, that human identity is never singular, but rather an ancient manuscript where the old texts are constantly bleeding through the new ones. Where the old texts are bleeding through the new ones. It makes you wonder about yourself.
It really does.
What invisible, ancient layers of identity, what forgotten overlays are currently bleeding through in your own culture, completely unrecognized by the people living it today, just waiting to be read?
Until next time, keep reading the layers.